on the road here. Welcome to Evolution Hour. TortuganWordspace.com, the website that contains mucho lot of stuff. Okay, let's see. There we go. That changes that around. Just finished watching The Superb Owl, or the last hour of The Superb Owl show on CBS, where apparently the Kansas City Chiefs pulled out a little rabbit from their hat and managed to defeat their rivals. So, as was appropriate, the team with the most points won, and however, it ran an hour overtime, so it delayed what I was really interested in, which was to catch Stephen Colbert, and after that, after midnight, to get some laughs for the night. Anyway, let us also call attention to our dear patrons, without whom things would be radically more complicated to get off the ground than are the case currently. Every one of you, I absolutely thank you for all the support you continue to give to the show, and we'll keep going at it as long as we can. So, where we are, close that off, and it's going to close off our little, there we go. As you know, we are continuing the source analysis of the cute little book Titans, creationists attempting to hijack dinosaurs for the field at large. And it's difficult to tell just exactly what information they're relying on because they neglected to provide a master bibliography for the show. So that's what we're doing, source by source by source. Still, roughly half of their material is being drawn. Hi, Slade! Is being drawn from a creationist literature, but every so often, as in this chapter, they're dangling a few technical papers. And it happens that Sarfati and Tay are stumbling into a problem in this episode. Hi, Brian. That's the same that we're in a part 2 related to Michael Ord. They're dealing with the issues of dinosaur taxonomy and preservation and the like. And hidden in the background, which they don't deal with, is the whole issue of biogeography and what is plausible post-flood distribution things. As far as I can tell, we're never going to get details on that. They're dealing at the moment with dangling some stuff about whether or not particular species are actually separate species or the juveniles of species. And they bring up some stuff that Horner had done in 2009 on pachycephalosaurs. Perfectly legitimate issue. For those who are not aware of pachycephalosaurs, they're a sparsely known group of almost exclusively North American taxa, ranging in size from bigger than a deinonychid up to somewhat larger, with very complicated bonehead things that look like a big bump on the top of their heads. And there was some thought that these might be like ram butting, but that doesn't seem to be terribly clear. But anyway, some members of what's coming up in this fragmentary fossil thing suggest, based upon the growth of the way the bones are going, that they might be actually juveniles of these species. And so this is the issue that the creationists are pouncing upon to supposedly show that all of regular paleontology is at a level of disarray sufficient to let their big slosh model sneak in through the background. So an awful lot of material isn't getting located in this. They're bringing out this 2009 paper, which I'll be putting a link to, and a contemporary paper by some other paleontologists on the topic that unfortunately isn't open access, so I won't be putting a link up to that. But we've got ones by some major players in the field, Evan, 2013, on the North American diversity, and some more about their biogeographical context and chronological context, of which there's some counterpart in the creationist thing, other than to just simply imply that it's from the flood. No, we're not getting anything. And to show you exactly how that mindset is at work, a thing that I had planned to bring up anyway turned out to be entirely appropriate, because it was Michael Ord when he's misrepresenting some paleontology on some Italian hadrosaurs. Hadrosaurs are those big herbivores, myosaurs, and the like, iguanodons, and it's a whole big broad range of ones, of where there are examples in Europe, and there are examples in Africa, and examples in the Americas, and so forth and so on. Anyway, they're riffing off, Oard is riffing off of this Chiaretta 2021 paper, which I'll be putting the link up to. It's open access. And the issue is whether they're all squished into a graveyard rather than showing up in separate levels. And an older study had thought in particular that a fossil was an adult, but later work suggested it was a subadult. That's about all that was going on. In other words, it's the fine-tuning of our understanding of this paleontology. As for the geology and the dating being overturned, as Oard was implying, that was also a stretch too, because what involves, turns out that they're looking at, there were more islands at this time, and the dating originally as to when these things had supposedly lived was less precisely grounded. So in other words, here we are in the 21st century, improving our understanding. Now, again, just as with the pachycephalosaurs, there's a biogeography to hadrosaurs in Cretaceous Europe. And that's from a paper from the same time frame that Oard isn't citing, one from Prito Marquez in 2021 that will clarify quite a lot on that. It's an intriguing subject matter because remember, all the fossils are found in particular deposits. And in principle, those deposits are going to have to be related somehow or other to the paleontology of the creationist worldview. Oh, by the way, here's a little chart that you'll find in the Evans paper on the Pachycephalosaurs, which is breaking down the fossil preservation and the various species distribution. There's not a hell of a lot of information available on the Pachycephalosaurs. They're not tremendously diverse. There is some evidence, not yet open access paper, but that there's an example coming from China. It too is a highly fragmentary fossil. But China at that time was accessible across what would later become the Bering Bridge in more modern times, so that there is a crossover between Asiatic dinosaurs and ones on the western side of the United States, what would become the United States. But the Italian dinosaur graveyard is in kind of the same ballpark. The Prito Marquez paper, which Oard is not citing, goes into quite a lot of detail about what the paleo world was. And you may notice in reading the Oard article, where is any detail, any maps, any clarification as to what the pre-flood world looked like and how the critters were making their way to the flood, to the Ark, because there would have had to have been samples of them aboard the Ark. Even Ark Encounter allows that. It's a mess. The Chiarenza paper is also really delicious. It's got quite a lot on the paleogeography, again, of the paleo world that existed and the critters that are being found, going into quite a bit of detail on how the geology is being dated and all the rest, of which our friend Oard offers absolutely nothing other than just the hand waving that, as he put it, burial in the Genesis flood remains the better solution, especially since the dinosaurs throughout the entire 10 meters of thin carbonate layers were all of the same species. Why would individuals of the same species be buried in the same location repeatedly during a period of over 2,000 years? Since they're not entirely complete skeletons, it's a matter of floodplains and stuff being dribbled downstream, and the body parts of the most dominant animals that are the least likely to be disappearing completely from scavenging end up in that area. Does the creationist have a model as to why that particular region gets the particular distributions of critters that they are, and why that layer doesn't in fact have a muck of stuff from a whole bunch of different things all mushed together in one super context? Because that's what the flood is supposedly doing. So they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to explain highly specialized distribution at the same time that they're trying to argue that this cataclysm is producing things that can't occur naturally. Well, they're never working out what the natural was in the pre-flood environment. Theoretically, each one of these little blips would make sense, hypothetically, in whatever the global conditions were and the environments in the paleo world that existed, or that this is a snapshot of what? Of section, because by their own definition, it's a highly restricted number of critters that are seen. You don't get into that. So, and you can watch out to see whether any anti-evolutionist ever is going to get that far working stuff out. We know that there's some confusion in the creationist community as to what in the hell the pre-flood world looked like. If you're operating from the old level from my generation, they're thinking in terms of effectively the same continental distribution that we have now, and they don't have any continental drift at all. If you're one of the more newer creationists, they'll be riffing off of Pangea as the pre-flood world, kind of, sort of, although they don't get into too many details and they have to rearrange stuff to land masses where there weren't. And it's a mess that you get into with Clary's mega sequences and all that stuff. Or you get the stuff that's over at the Creation Museum, implying that Rodinia is the supercontinent, which is a very different landmass distribution, oriented in a very different way. Hundreds of millions of years difference between that and Pangea in the standard model. And that somehow or other then Pangea is forming either during or slightly after the flood, and then the present world is occurring during the kind of backwash. A broad range of view. Neither model warps. Yes, they're in any attempt to try to figure out how the land masses, whatever land masses they're dealing with, how much of the material they want to parasitize from the standard geology, and it looks like using Rodinia or Pangea, they're just riffing off of the standard geology selectively. They're not really working out primary work on their own recognizance. Snelling, Clary, Oard, they're not up at that level of that out. So basically, they're trying to take the data, just like the baraminologists are with cladistic information, that is occurring from the regular scientists and somehow morphing it around. Well, they haven't even got to that level. And it's going to be funky to see them ever try to do that. So anyway, these papers will be a fun one to get at for those who want to investigate that side of it, because it's a marvelous example of the detail that the regular scientific community goes through, and the nothing burger, a vaporized nitty crust of the earth they do. Yes, yeah, that's I think a little bit to the heat problem in volume 1 of The Rocks Were There. Boy, are we going to make some more mentions of it, particularly after Gutsick Gibbon did an absolutely blistering, if I may use adjective, summary of all the different pile-up of heat problem issues that any attempt to take the geologic system and compress it into a short time frame inevitably accelerates the amount of heat involved. And to be fair, the creationist community as a whole remains pretty brain dead on this subject. They know it exists as an issue, but boy, they don't want to dive into it much. So it's a thing that happens way on the periphery. You do get occasional papers, and we'll be alluding to them in the new book from people who have, in the creationist community that have tried to address this issue. But all too many of them have to fall back on the approach that the Carter types and that do, and Humphreys and that, which is that it was just a miracle, which means they're now transcending the whole logic of the old Duane Gish era creationism, where they were arguing that physical processes inevitably operating in physical ways make the processes of the flood completely visible and understandable and inevitable and accurate. Well, if you have to reach the point where you're suddenly pulling little miracles out of a hat to resolve the untenability of the scenario, you got problems. And the it's unclear how honest Oard could be being at this, or Sarfati and Tay for that matter. I mean, these are people who must be well enough aware of the technical literature in their own field to know how much of these are problems lurking around in the background, and yet they're not exactly going out of their way to deal with it. You get more coverage on the heat problem, trying to dispose of it by the standing for truth level. than you're getting in the regular creationist literature, which is an indication is that they are recognizing just how big of a problem it is, that it's one that they know the numbers on them. They can't make the numbers go away. And once in a while, somebody can come along, they can grasp at straws that the next little trick. Some have argued, for example, that somehow or other the heat was being dissipated in space. But space is really big. And if it's expanding along space, it means that when you start running those numbers, you find that it would have to be cooling down way faster than just cooling off the heat. It would turn the Earth into an icicle. So whatever it is, it's going to be a problem, especially when all of this theoretically is happening in the time frame from creation down through the flood. And then things settle down in a hurry to be the kind of world that we can look at from our nice uniformitarian things. They have the curves for carbon decay dropping off like abrupt, so that by the time you get down to radiocarbon dating of biblical times, in the times of patriarchs and all of that, then they're kind of okay with accurate radiocarbon dating. Slade, yes. Well, you can always catch it on the rebound. I was pointing out the basic structure of the young Earth creationist inability to deal with their own model when it comes to the biogeography and paleo environment, and as well as the whole issue of preservation of why particular taxa are preserved in what particular way. And then Don Giovanni brought up the vaporize the crust from the heat problem. And I was just alluding to the fact that in the new book, we'll be alluding in much more detail to that heat problem, because there have been so many delicious new posts on the subject. It's a fun thing because even just since the time we wrote the first book, there's been just an enormous upgrade in the level of criticism and the details. People like Dan Stern-Cardinale and Zach Hancock, who have a genetics training way above my pay grade and above co-author Jackson's biology degree, are weighing in on Nathaniel Jensen and Sanford and Carter and their claptrap attempts to press the genealogies, the stuff that we covered in the previous series on the Jensen book. It sounds about right for creationist logic. There's no evidence in heat problem, so there was no heat problem. Yes. Yeah. Or there's always the wishful thinking aspect that it's ironic with somebody like Standing for Truth, who was always prattling on about the rescue mechanisms that evolutionists supposedly have to indulge in, ultimately resorting to a rescue mechanism in presuming that somewhere there are people out there who are working out this problem and are going to be resolving it any minute now. Please don't hold the coffee. That we're never going to be seeing on. And so that failure to work out rigorously the details of their own model in any way that is even remotely comparable, they can come up with the visual imagery. And so, well, even there, I mean, if you look at the paleo maps that occasionally they offer in some of their technical literature, the mega sequences and stuff, it's still at a very rudimentary cartoon level. And it's not nearly as meticulous as you're finding in the regular technical literature. Yeah, well, I don't mind about the terminology of it. I'll call myself an evolutionist because terms don't bother me much. It's content that matters. So you can call me James, or you can call me Johnny, or you can call me JJ, as the old comedian went. That doesn't bother me. Terminology is just nomenclature, and however you want to do it. And if you have an odd nomenclature, define it. I've, after all, coined the word Tortugan. So I have no problems with that aspect. But ultimately, it theoretically should be reflecting a model, and it should be one that is got some chops to it and is actually making some headway somewhere. Creationism has been monumentally unsuccessful in making any penetration into any of the sciences, and the intelligent design movement that has come along since the 1990s, likewise, is getting no market penetration. They have occasional converts. You've got, and some with technical degrees, It's cooling down a little here, 4:30 p.m. and only 37. Yeah, our temperature's kind of been jumping all over the place. We're in that La Nina cycle, so we have kind of a warm winter. Very little snow in Spokane this year. I didn't have to take the snow shovel except, tiny bit. And that means it's a problem for the ski resorts and a lot of other things, and which gets back to the whole issue of climate and how all of that figures up. So given the reluctance of politicians to get their head on straight and the degree to which Rhino-Trumpistas are still in positions of power on these things, we're probably going to be dilly-dallying quite a bit. So welcome to a bumpy 21st century. You start with bullshit, it's difficult to recover anything. Well, it's Gutsick Gibbon and Dapper Dino, and so many of these are people who come from a creationist background, and many of them are relatively recently leaving the creationist background. All of them had minds that ultimately were ill-suited to creationism because they would fact-check stuff, and they would be curious. And as soon as they get out in the bigger world and start having access to the fuller data set, woo, the things that they were raised in don't look terribly impressive. And the extent to which it backfires on the believer to keep people in the little straitjacket, whether it's IG, CMI, ICR, or Kent Hovind or any of the other little sidebars, that if they have minds that are not basically Tortugan, and they finally start getting out in the bigger world, they have a tendency to dunk the whole belief system rather than just the creationism part. Than the geology and paleontology stuff. They'll just think, well, the whole religion is a pile of dingo kidneys, because that is seen as a package deal in that rigid worldview. If they have a different aspect where they've come up in a more broad-ranging one that has already had to deal with working out the age of the earth and the like, the Joel Duff worldview, they're much more amenable to dealing things. Duff is a devout Christian. I'm not a believer, and so we're coming at the biblical aspect differently, and we probably have a different level of God modules in our head. And brain was turned on. Yeah, my contention is that I've been showing, hopefully, in all of these episodes that I've been doing, is that the source methods angle of not merely lobbing the science data at them, but looking at the science data that the creationists themselves are attempting to show supposedly supports their side, that you can then contrast that with what the scientists actually are offering. That's why I want people to be able to look at the original papers. And don't take my word for it, read it yourself. And you'll find over and over again this broad, wonderful example of the scientific investigations that are piecing together in these wonderful levels of detail and the level of source information. Each one of those expands. You can follow any of those any direction that you want. Whereas in the creationist worldview, it's all intensely insular, that they will kind of riff off a paper or two, but they'll very quickly want to steer you back onto their own apologetics. And that's what Sarfati and Tay have been doing in their book. That, they bring up now and then some technical papers, and they're running at about 50% misrepresentation or data avoidance level so far. It's not a huge number of technical papers that they've been presenting. And still, the vast majority of the book is merely repeating stuff from their CMI kitback. Not terribly impressive from my point of view. I kind of did it. I couldn't resist having a sneak peek at the pachycephalosaurs, since they're being brought up in this section of this chapter on the taxonomy, to see, do they go into much detail about them in the actual section on the pachycephalosaurs? And the answer is no. And indeed, when we get down to that, it's going to be hilarious, because they're not sure what kind they belong to. Maybe if it's a family, then it's a kind if you take it at that level, but they're not necessarily opposed to lumping the pachycephalosaurs in with a larger group of ornithischians. No details being offered, no creationist terminology work being cited, because, of course, there isn't any. They haven't done any. And I would suggest that if they tried to do that, they're going to slam into the data field, even as limited as it is with pachycephalosaurs, that they're going to have to be leaving stuff out, and they will never be able to work out within their own frame a logically consistent paleo world that will be able to get anywhere near the detail and consents that you find for the standard geological world that we're getting by the technical material that, say, a Nick Zentner presents in relation to the Pacific Northwest geology. And every area would be falling into that same regard. So given how big the planet is and how many technical papers are involved with every single zone, that it's a Sisyphus enterprise. The creationists are attempting to push a rock up the hill, not that the rock is going to roll back down the next day and they're going to have to start over, but they can't get the rock to move. That there's this great hill of science data up there, and the best they can do is just roll the rock around in place and basically see it sink slowly farther back because they can't make any headway on anything. Yeah, that's lazy thinkers. Yes, that's why I coined the word Tortugan, and I wish people would be using it more because it's a way of categorizing people without a pejorative attached to it. It's from Latin for turtle, and Tortuga is an analog of that, and I think there's some stuff popping up in some video games that have used the terminology on a completely different context, just as a term for something. But it's a handy one because no one's used it in the way that I'm dealing with it. And it's to describe people who have a mind shell. They have a belief they really want to be true, and they have a mind that's easily addicted to secondary sources, things that repeat what they want to be true, a very limited data field, that the more unreliable the data field is, the more trouble they're in intellectually, because since they never fact check any of it, they are getting into more and more of a problem. So Tortugan minds could be on the borderline of things, vaccines or certain political conspiracies or other ideologies, where it's a fairly mild phenomenon. But if their source base is really unreliable, as you see with creationism and flat Earth and the moon landing is a hoax and things like that, then because they're still not checking anything, they can go off in just absolutely screwball directions. Flurfers, flat earthers would be a perfectly fine description. They are practically the poster child for the Tortugan mindset, would be a flat earther. Because, spoiler alert, the Earth is definitely not flat, period. So when you think about how a flat earther, and we're talking about honest flat earthers, there are some that I'm sure are just over the top trolls who can make some money at it on YouTube. They can get monetized, can have 1 million views, etc., etc. And the more outrageous they are, the more money they make, but they don't necessarily have to believe a word of it. Those I don't care about. But the ones that actually sincerely do believe it, everybody that goes into this area is noticing how repetitive their apologetics are, how they're repeating the same tropes over and over and over again, tropes they have probably never investigated. Only a tiny, small number, as in maybe under a dozen, flat earthers will ever get to the stage of actually trying to perform an experiment to test out their model, and often bungle it when they try to do it, because either they test it and find out that they're wrong, or they just perform it so badly that they get bad results out of it. And so they think they are still have an argument. It's a hilarious phenomenon to deal with. They are a niche area to look at, though, because there are relatively few flat earthers, and apart from an occasional entertainment figure or somebody that will have jumped on the bandwagon, they're inconsequential. They don't really play a part in any government that I can think of. They're not ones running for governor or being in Congress or whatever. Very different when you shift over to young Earth creationism and its kissing cousin, creationism light, intelligent design, because there, holy smokes, they are very critical. And it's not just in this country. I would suggest that analogs to the creationist mindset are playing a part in Erdogan's government, in Turkey, in Orban in Hungary, and the enablers of Putin in Russia with the Russian Orthodox Church, the Hindu authoritarian of, oh God, I can't think of his name right off the bat, but anyway, he's the current prime minister of India. He's reflecting like a Hindu nationalist creationism. And of course, we've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, we've got the Speaker of the House, all apparently flood-believing young Earth creationists. Didn't say well, and I've never heard Trump say the Earth is flat. In fact, I think Trump is too much of a harebrained ignoramus to get far enough to really get into any of that area. It was highly revealing that in all of the Trump years, there was not a single whiff of interest in getting creationism in the schools during his reign. And if he had been an ideologue that had an interest in that, I would have thought he would have done it. His one bugbear was to get anti-abortion judges onto the courts, and he did that not because he had a conviction in the area. I think he could care less. He could probably flip to be pro-choice if he thought he could get to be the president again, but based on it. But it's because his support base wanted it, and he delivered. Not all by his own lonesome, because Mitch McConnell helped, and Federalist Society funneling in judge names and so forth and so on. So he didn't do it all alone. But by and large, I don't think science interests Trump in the least. He watches Fox Trump Pravda and maybe some other media sources pretty much 24/7, and is sucking all of that material in, and they don't really cover the science as much at all. You get some slightly creationist material on the website angle of Fox, and that's been popping up over the years, but Trump is not a reader, so he wants audio. And so if it isn't an audio program that's being done by Waters or somebody else there, he's not really going to be dealing with it. I would be flabbergasted if he'd ever seen a Nova special or anything that was a purely scientific-based, BBC type coverage. I think he would probably get bored silly, because I think he probably has the attention span of a gnat. And of course, because he may very well be an undiagnosed dyslexic, it's very possible that any kind of serious reading is not going to be comfortable for him. So I thought he said he didn't notice the curve or something. I have not heard that one about Trump. Trump has many stupid ideas. One of the most recent ones, when he was, for how he came up with, I have no idea, but that somehow or other sticking magnets in water deactivates them. And then, of course, he gets weird crap that clearly has come from listening to Fox Trump Pravda on the windmills, offshore wind farms, killing whales. That's a thing that was covered by a false claim from Fox, and whoop, suddenly appears in a Trump speech. So there's various people over the years that have been following what appears on Fox and then what metastasizes in Trump speeches and shows the clear connection there is on that. I don't think Trump has the imagination or the interest to come up with a lot of these ideas himself. And I don't think he circulates in the really fringe YouTube network level. I think he wants to circulate with celebrity, and he likes that psychological buffer. So just some little Hanyak on YouTube wouldn't interest him. But if it's on his approved enablers shows that have regular advertisers and the like, that reinforces his illusion that they are reliable, that's a different kettle of fish. Future scholars can go plowing through all of this stuff, assuming that we manage to have future scholars and do not dissolve into a world of Trump having a second term and then dissolving the Constitution in 2028 and making Eric the new president, or some screwball thing like that. Until we're past the election this fall, everything's up for grabs, and we have to proceed things one thing at a time. It is sad for me, and I pointed this out. My friends know, but I'm an old Reagan voter, and there were problems that I had with the Reagan administration, but I voted for him both times, and began to shift off of that precisely because of the mounting extremism that began to take over the Republican Party in the 80s and 90s. They were in there in the Reagan years, but it just started to get worse and worse and worse. And it reached the point where I voted for Clinton in 92 and have been voting consistently Democrat ever since, because the Republicans are the anti-science party. And I cannot tolerate and favor a party that is as entrenched with scientific illiteracy on climate issues, on medicine, on they can go fine and dandy on technology if it has some military application, and the kind of gee whiz, let's fire a rocket to Mars kinds of stuff for propaganda purposes. But getting the gist of what science means in a Star Trekky sort of way, yeah, that's not their thing. Says yes. Trump, his psychological difficulty certainly has to do with his being a pathological narcissist. And you find a counterpart. I've described Kent Hovind as the Donald Trump of creationism, or you can regard Kent Hovind as the Donald Trump as the Kent Hovind of politics. They're isomorphic, same personalities. And there are other people that pop up. There was a figure in the anti-vaxxer AIDS denialist movement, Manus, I think his name is, that was described at the time that he died in 2019 as a very Trumpian style, narcissistic, bullying, hedonistic personality. And so it pops up in a lot of contexts. I think it's dangerous to have them in political power, and it's dangerous to have them even in relatively minor levels of power. A Tortugan, narcissistic, pseudoscientific, coddling mind is just as dangerous on a school board or a city council or a state representative or a circuit court judge or an official relating to anything in regards to anything where it matters. They can make maybe some semi-accurate positions every once in a while, but it's almost accidental because they have a mind that it can be easily untethered from facts if the facts are something the ideology doesn't like to be true. And so ultimately, it's a methodological question. And people really need to be asking way more methods questions. We won't get a chance to do that with Kathy McMorris Rodgers this fall because she's decided not to run for re-election. Yay! And so her seat may be open again. And so it's going to be funky to see whether or not some other screwball Republican pops up, because in the Republican end of it, the Spokane County is a very conservative district. But we've also got in the metropolitan area a much more liberal mindset, and we do have some Democrats. It's the old seat that used to be Foley, who for a while was Speaker of the House, and that was in a much more civil times when both parties could actually get some things done. Are there non-screwball Republicans? Not many. In Washington state politics, as far as I can see, practically none. They're right-wing Trumpista nutballs. And there are a few that pop up. Typically, they're the ones that have decided to retire. They were the ones that were voting against certain policies in the Republican Party. They're the kinds that are immediately denounced as rhinos by the Trumpistas. And somebody as hyper-conservative as Liz Cheney is treated as a Republican in name only in the Trumpista worldview. And I'm going, what? No, that's absolute claptrap. And it's sad to have seen how long it took Cheney to get a grip on why Trump was a problem, because the sad thing is there are far too many ones that are now disliking Trump 2024 who had every reason to dislike him before then, but just didn't think about it that way. And it sounds like a trick question for me. But I'm old enough to remember a much more varied Republican Party. And even in the era, especially in the era before Reagan, you had a actual full-out liberal Republicans, and then you had all the way through to conservative Republicans, and that could get awfully conservative at times. I mean, I remember Joe McCarthy was a Republican back in the 40s. So you have this constant mix in the same way that the Democratic Party had a broad range from very leftist McGovern-style Democrats, hyper-liberals. Not by modern-day standards, I really can't call them terribly radical. Certainly not as far out in many respects as a Bernie Sanders style Democrat would be today. And then that would all the way down to hyper-conservative segregationist Democrats from the South, many of whom shifted party and became Republicans, or still may label themselves Democrats, but vote in that conservative Republican mode in the time of Nixon on. So it's been a long-term thing, and it's occurred within my lifetime. And because I have a history of the American experience in my historical training, I have an awareness of how the Republican Party has shifted over time. In a broad cliche, the thing we've got that is, I've mentioned it in previous episodes, and I have no reason, sadly, to get rid of my doubts, is that the 2020s are reminding me disconcertingly of the 1920s, when you had increasing polarization, increasing radicalization. We have to remember that Mussolini took power in Italy in the 1920s. You had authoritarian regimes starting to percolate up in the 20s and 30s in Hungary and other places, some of the same areas that are still having a vexing problem for us today. And ultimately, it led to the economic depression. That's why I don't want to see a global depression on the planet, because that was the energy that turned these localized hotspots into the extremism that got us into World War II. And I'm not at all sure that things would have turned out as horrifyingly bad had we not had the big stock market crash and a bunch of bad policies in a bunch of different nations, from Montague Norman with the Bank of England monetarist policies, and the squeeze the Germans until they drop French policies against the Germans, and all of that all going on at the same time to turn a stock market crash in the United States into not merely a depression, but a global depression. And the fact that there were sleep switch Republicans in this critical period in the 1920s, when those processes started to escalate. Historically, then I would argue that it really took 8 years to screw up the American economy. And that's how basically the time frame you had for the Harding-Coolidge administration, because I don't blame Hoover per se for the cataclysm. He just was not up to be able to resolve it, because it exceeded the load limit of the 1920s Republican imagination. Likewise, the second Bush administration, it took quite a few years, second term, before the shit hit fan, and a couple $1 trillion vaporized almost overnight, and we had to switch gears for Obama, who deserves an amazing amount of credit for the pull-up out of that giant tank. No more graphic measures this than the Dow Jones, the standard stock market thing adjusted for inflation. That when you look at the Dow Jones, and I remember back at a time when a Dow Jones over 1,000 was considered impossible. I'm that old. Now we couldn't even imagine the Dow Jones below 10,000, let alone 1,000. But anyway, that there was the big run-up that occurred in the Reagan and Bush 1 and Clinton years. And then Bush 2 comes in, and it kind of stops about 14, 15,000 on the Dow. And then in 2008, bloop, the big drop down. And then the Obama big bull market comes in. It is at just the same angle of rise, that gigantic Reagan, Bush, Clinton bull market, except it's digging us out of a big hole. But eventually it did dig us out of the big hole and went even higher by about 10 or 15,000 points. Still $4 trillion missing from the Pentagon accounting second Bush era. Yes, there's when you reach that level of clumsiness, especially when you're involving big contractors that are on the public tit, then you get into trouble. And that's why, all of this involves the need for constant congressional oversight and public information and all of that. I mean, there's no magic panacea. You just can't say, well, just vote in Democrats and everything will be sweet and buddy, good, or vote in Republicans. The problem is today we don't really have many Republicans left. And so you've got shapeshifters like J.D. Vance. You've got suck-ups like Lindsey Graham. And then you have just screwballs, the Ted Cruzes and others that are all dogma and bluster and bluff. And if they manage to come up with even a remotely accurate policy on anything, it's practically a miracle. We can't manage that anymore. We can't afford as a nation to have such incompetence at a governance level, because there's way too many issues and way too many neat things to do that are going to require a government efficient and manages money reasonably and helps the general welfare in a way that the trickle down approach of decades of Republican policies have objectively failed to do. We have massive reforms we have to deal with in terms of housing to get affordable housing on things. And this will rub an awful lot of real estate developers the wrong way. And we're also coming into the fact that just continual growth, the idea of building just nothing but new places rather than transforming the places that already exist, they're getting into the limitation of water tables and electric grids, and just there's it's just a lot of stuff. And if you have a basically pre-scientific medievalist way of looking at the world, think Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's no way in hell these people can be resolving any of these situations. So we've got a lot of things to be done, and it needs to be done at the grassroots. It needs to involve local media. If you still got local media, some of these things are in trouble because you've got the consolidation of media companies. You have that bunch that's owned by Sinclair. One of the big TV stations over in Seattle is owned by Sinclair. So there's these little leak-ins of little propaganda stuff that it's pretending to be news interviews. Fortunately, none of the major TV and radio stations here in Spokane are part of that Sinclair network. So we have genuinely solid investigative and analytical things. We have a very strong, vibrant public broadcasting channel here. So we have a little island of sanity in addition to Marjorie Taylor Greene types knocking around in the periphery. Anyway, there is no immediate instant solution to it other than us kids. And the new generation, I'm an old fart, but younger generations, they need 100 million people didn't vote in 2020 who could have. You've got to have a much greater voter penetration. Some of those voters will be Tortuga nutballs. And so look at the fact that Trump got 10 million more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. Now, Biden got an even larger vote, but nonetheless, make no presumption that there aren't an awful lot of people out there who are also fence straddlers who may decide to not fence straddle, who have mindsets just like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and are deciding, well, then they better vote in this time to get that evil Mr. Biden out. That will be how they'll be playing it, and Trump will be playing it up in that regards. And so given the diciness of certain states and things that have been going on, it's not at all clear that Trump might not squeak through the electoral college, even if he loses the popular vote again. So all is flux, all is funks. Anyway, on that cheerful note, once the video gets settled in, I'll be putting the link up to the information that's in here so everybody can follow up on the papers on it. And it's just neat stuff that the paleo worlds of actual science are always going to be 1,000 miles ahead of the cartoon attempts. You'd think with the graphics level that they have at Answers in Genesis and others, they have no problems with skill set. So if they had the data field, they could do much more sophisticated analysis than they had if their model was correct. But it ain't. Yes, yeah. The politics is, we're living in perilous times, and people push the methods end of it. Don't require that anybody take anybody's word for it. I never require anybody to take my word for it. I think you're running up the bark up the wrong tree if you do. you should be building an understanding of things. Yes, yeah, blaming Taylor Swift. Yes, the absurd hissy fits that people get into. One of the things that we'll have to be dealing with over the next 10, 15, 20 years is to kind of get used to how we're dealing with all these new media, because and the fact that people now have AI that can come up with very vivid of stuff that's fake. We have to deal with the fact that you have to be careful to ground things in accurate information. And the speed with which stupid can metastasize is a factor that we have to be dealing with. I don't think it's an insoluble problem, but it's one that we don't think about to our peril because it's the future involved. I don't plan on checking out anytime soon, so I could still live around to see an awful lot of things screw up. So I want there to be things so my great grandniece and the like have a world that I can hand over to them and say, hey, kid, this is going to be really neat. You're going to enjoy it. Rather than one in which we're dogs and cats living together and eating one another and zombies running around, metaphorically speaking. So anyway, this is a good 50-minute time. I've blathered on enough about up and down. May I remind everybody that if you aren't a patron of the thing and you think my stuff is worth the thing, do become a patron. There's links always in the videos for that affair. If you are a patron already and you know people, say, hey, pay attention to RJ. And if you think he's doing good stuff, consider being a patron yourself. I look at the level of patronage that some of the other people can get in various channels, and I can go, wow. Remember, there's no commercials on this show. You know, you're never going to have a sudden Epoch Times ad pop up in the middle of things, which happens even on Pelagia. So there's an element of about the genuine grassroots level of this is not a commercial enterprise kind of thing. And boy, does it show. And then, of course, all the books, the fiction and nonfiction, there's always links to them as well. And then there's a bundle of information that I stand behind. I'm very proud of the stuff that I did in the old Troubles in Paradise website. A lot of that material is going to be reformatted and restructured for future books as I can update all that into the 21st century and hopefully make a little bit money on the side on it, which is the thing that one must do in this stressful environment. I'd love to reach the point where I can afford to pay off my home equity loan and take out a new one so that I could get bloody basement plumbing reconstructed. It's got leakages and stuff, so that's making things fun. But anyway, we're keeping at all the different projects and all the rest, and one day at a time, kids, one day at a time. So anyway, let me put my little ad up for The Rocks Were There, as I am well aware of. It's bloody loud. And I will concede all of that at up front. Let's see, got it over there to share screen. There we go. Up. And move you over here and go zap. And there's our little show and even our little advert. And oh, exactly. Yes. Regarding anybody, and Dapper Dino and others make exactly the same point. Never under any circumstance put anything for moi ahead of what is important to make sure that you have your bills paid and all of the necessities and the things that you need to do one day at a time. What that you're and only if you have some little spare cash or something that you can, do the $1 a month Patreon or whatever in that respect, or getting books in that, only if you have other things taken care of. I would not want that under any circumstance. Anyway, keep an eye out for the dangerous wooden penguins, and we shall be seeing everybody next week. Stay safe, everybody. Ending